The year was 1945, and the world stood at the edge of history. Europe was burning, cities were shattered, families were broken, and millions prayed for an end to a war that had consumed the planet. For 6 endless years, the Allies were closing in on the heart of Nazi Germany, pushing back against the darkness that had once seemed unstoppable. Adolf Hitler was cornered, his armies collapsing, his empire crumbling brick by brick. Everyone knew the war was nearing its final chapter, but nobody could imagine the storm that was about to erupt inside the Allied leadership itself. Inside a heavily guarded war conference room deep in Europe, two of the most powerful leaders of the Allied world faced each other across a large strategy table. On one side sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the man responsible for leading the liberation of Western Europe. Calm, deliberate, and thoughtful, Eisenhower carried the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. On the other side sat Winston Churchill, the fiery and determined British Prime Minister whose voice had carried his people through the darkest nights of the war. Churchill was passionate, relentless, and deeply driven by history, pride, and duty. Maps were pinned across the table, marked with red arrows pushing toward Berlin from the west, and the Soviet lines advancing from the east. The German army was in chaos. Roads were clogged with retreating soldiers. Allied troops were sweeping across Germany faster than anyone predicted. And there, in the center of everything, sat Berlin, the capital of the Nazi regime, the symbolic heart of Hitler's power, the city whose fall would mark the true end of the war. Churchill believed with every fiber of his being that the Allies, not the Soviets, must reach Berlin first. To him, Berlin was not just a city, it was a statement to the world. It represented honor, sacrifice, and victory. British and American soldiers had bled on beaches and fields. From North Africa to Normandy, they had crossed oceans and continents. They had buried friends and brothers. Churchill could not bear the thought of the red Soviet flag rising over Berlin, while the Allies stood back and watched. He feared what Soviet control would mean for the future of Europe, and he was right to fear it. With urgency tightening his voice, Churchill leaned toward Eisenhower and spoke firmly. "We must advance on Berlin immediately. We must not give Stalin the satisfaction of taking the prize alone. The British Empire and the United States must not stand aside and let the Russians seize the heart of Germany." His words carried the raw emotion of a man who had spent years fighting to save his country from total destruction. His eyes burned with conviction and pride. To Churchill, this was more than strategy, it was legacy. But Eisenhower did not move. He remained still, thoughtful, rational. His face showed the exhaustion of a commander who had lived more days making decisions than sleeping. He knew what Churchill wanted, but he also knew what the situation required. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his eyes to meet Churchill's. He spoke quietly, but firmly, with the weight of responsibility behind every word. "Mr. Prime Minister, Berlin is not our military objective." The room froze. Officers holding maps stopped breathing. Churchill stepped back as if struck. Eisenhower continued, explaining that the cost of reaching Berlin would be catastrophic. Intelligence estimated that invading the city could cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. The German forces fighting to defend the capital were preparing to fight to the last man, turning every street into a graveyard. Eisenhower knew that the war was already won, that Germany's surrender was only days away. To him, risking that many lives simply for a symbolic city would be betrayal. He explained that the agreed-upon Allied strategy divided German territory into zones, and Berlin already fell into the Soviet zone according to previous agreements signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Yalta. Breaking that agreement could shatter the Allied coalition at the most critical moment. If the Allies stormed Berlin, Stalin would feel betrayed, and the war could ignite again, this time between former allies. The world could collapse into chaos. Eisenhower finished with the words spoken not as a general, but as a man who carried the grief of war. "I will not spill the blood of American boys for a ground we do not need." The room went silent. You could hear the ticking of a clock, Outside, wind rattled the tent walls, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Churchill's face flushed red. His hands trembled not with fear, but with frustration, disappointment, and disbelief. He knew Eisenhower spoke truth, but truth was not what his heart wanted. For a moment, he paced the floor, gripping his cane, staring down at the map like a general on the verge of a breaking point. He felt history slipping through his fingers. He turned sharply and looked Eisenhower in the eyes. "If we allow Stalin to reach Berlin first, we may win the war, but we will lose the peace." The words cut into the air like a blade. Churchill's voice cracked under the emotional weight he could no longer hide. He had seen too much to be calm. He had watched Europe break apart once already, and he feared it would happen again. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every officer present felt as though they were witnessing a moment that would be written in textbooks for centuries. Two men, two visions, one future. But Eisenhower did not waver. He had built his entire command on discipline, unity, and protecting life wherever possible. He believed history would judge him more harshly for pointless bloodshed than for refusing a symbolic victory. Berlin, to him, was already lost, not to the enemy, but to political agreements made months earlier. After a long silence, Churchill spoke again, quieter now, but with deep emotional pain. "I fear you are making a decision that will haunt the free world." The words were not anger anymore, they were sorrow. Eisenhower simply nodded, and the conference ended. People filed out slowly, each man changed by what he had just heard. Churchill remained standing alone for a moment, staring at the map. He placed his hand on Berlin, as if holding the city in his palm, and whispered to himself, "History will remember this day." Outside the command center, snow drifted across the ground. Soldiers moved trucks and artillery. Engines roared in the distance. The world continued forward, unaware of the storm behind closed doors. And at that moment, the future of Europe was decided. Not on a battlefield, but in a quiet room, where two leaders fought with words instead of bullets. The question that remained was, what would Churchill say next? Would he accept the decision, or would he fight to change it? The answer would shake the Allied command and the world in ways no one expected. When Churchill stepped out of the command tent, the cold air struck his face like a slap. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the gray sky, dissolving against his coat, but he barely felt them. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He walked slowly, leaning more heavily than usual on his cane, each step echoing his frustration and disappointment. The guards standing outside the doorway could sense the weight hanging over him, but none dared speak. They simply watched the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom march past them with the fierce determination of a man fighting not an enemy, but time itself. Inside Churchill's field quarters, a fire crackled weakly in the fireplace. Maps covered the walls, and telephones waited silently on the tables like coiled snakes ready to strike. Churchill threw his hat onto a chair and lowered himself heavily into the seat behind his desk. For a long moment he said nothing, staring into the flames, his mind racing. Victory was so close he could almost taste it, yet the price of that victory and the shape of the world that would follow now felt painfully uncertain. His military advisor, General Sir Alan Brooke, entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He had been at the meeting. He had watched the clash between Churchill and Eisenhower with his own eyes. He knew the Prime Minister was in torment. Carefully, he spoke. "Winston, the Americans have made their decision. We must consider how to respond." Churchill lifted his gaze, and Brooke saw something he had rarely seen in him, a deep and wounded grief. Churchill pressed his hand against his forehead and exhaled slowly. "We fought this war not just to stop Hitler," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "We fought to protect the future, and I fear the decisions being made today may hand tomorrow to Stalin." Without a fight, his voice cracked, and Brooke felt the weight of every soldier lost on battlefields oceans away. But Churchill was not a man easily broken. Slowly, determination returned to his eyes. The same fire that had rallied London during the Blitz, the same strength that had kept Britain alive when they stood alone against Germany. He rose from his seat, gripping the edge of the table. "We cannot allow the Soviets to seize all of Eastern Europe uncontested," he said. "We must not simply watch history slip through our hands." He moved to the map pinned to the wall and pressed his finger over Berlin. "If that Russian flag rises here before the American or British flag, the balance of power will shift for generations." His voice hardened. "I will not let the sacrifices of our soldiers end in the shadow of a new tyranny." Brooke hesitated, then spoke honestly. "But Eisenhower has made up his mind. He will not divide the Allied unity. He will not risk the blood of his men for a city promised to Stalin." Churchill closed his eyes as if bracing against physical pain. He understood Eisenhower's logic, but logic did not soften his fear. After a long silence, Churchill turned toward the telephone. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the receiver. He asked to be connected to London and prepared to speak with his war cabinet. When the call connected, his voice thundered through the line with raw urgency. "We must press our case with Washington. We cannot surrender Berlin without exhausting every possible effort. We must appeal to President Truman himself, if necessary." Members of the cabinet listened with breathless attention as Churchill described the danger ahead. He warned that the Soviets were advancing faster than expected, that their intentions for Europe were unclear, and that failing to act now would transform a military victory into a political disaster. "We must not allow Moscow to shape Europe alone," he said. "If the United States does not move, Britain must urge them to reconsider." That night Churchill did not sleep. He sat at his desk, writing by lamplight, composing a message of extraordinary urgency to President Harry Truman. His words were careful but powerful, carrying the emotional weight of a leader fighting for the future. In the letter he wrote, "If Berlin falls to the Red Army alone, the world will not see this as justice, it will see it as surrender. I implore you to consider what the balance of power will be when the dust settles." Meanwhile, word of Eisenhower's decision reached Soviet headquarters. Joseph Stalin smiled when he heard it, a smile that chilled the men around him. To him, Berlin was not just a victory, it was proof of supremacy. If Berlin fell to the Russians, Stalin would gain leverage over the entire post-war world. He believed the Americans lacked the resolve to fight for Europe's future, and now, he thought, Eisenhower had proven him right. Stalin's generals began moving with a ferocious intensity, determined to win the race at any cost. Back in the British camp, Churchill gathered his closest advisors for a private midnight meeting. His voice was quieter now, weary from battle and emotion. "I have pleaded my case," he said, "but Eisenhower has chosen his path." He paused, his hand resting on the arm of his chair. "If the Americans will not march on Berlin, then we must prepare for the world that follows. A world divided not by war, but by power." The room was silent. Churchill's eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with heartbreak. "I fear we may soon exchange one tyranny for another." The commanders lowered their heads. They understood. 2 days later, formal reply arrived. President Truman stood firmly behind Eisenhower's decision. The Western Allies would halt their advance short of Berlin. The order was final. When Churchill read it, his shoulders sank. He closed his eyes slowly and whispered, "God help us all." Those in the room felt the weight of those words settle like ash. The Prime Minister set the letter down, took a long breath, and said, in a voice filled with sorrow and steel, "History will judge this moment, and I pray we are not judged harshly." But even in disappointment, Churchill's spirit refused to yield. He turned to his staff and declared, "Then we must prepare for what comes next, for the peace will be harder to win than the war." He believed deeply that a storm of political conflict was coming, and he was right. Across Europe, the Soviets pushed forward with unstoppable force. Allied soldiers watched from a distance as the thunder of Soviet artillery echoed toward the heart of Berlin, and Churchill stood in silence, feeling as though he was watching the future slip away. Still, he was not done speaking. He had one more message, one that would echo through the world, and that message would shake history. The world outside Churchill's window was slowly waking, but inside his headquarters, time felt frozen. The sky was growing lighter, yet his heart felt heavier than ever. The letter from Washington lay on the table, its edges slightly crumpled from being held too tightly. The decision was final. Berlin would not be taken by the Western Allies. The Soviet flag would rise first, and the future of Europe would change forever. Churchill stared at the letter for a long time, his eyes clouded with grief. The flickering lamp beside him cast shadows across his face, exaggerating the tired lines carved deep into his skin by years of war, loss, and unrelenting pressure. For the first time in many years, he looked not like an unbreakable lion, but like a man who had carried the weight of a dying world upon his shoulders for far too long. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "This decision will be remembered, and not kindly." Those close to him could see that behind those quiet words lay a storm of emotion, heartbreak, frustration, fear, and above all, responsibility. Yet even in despair, Churchill understood that leadership did not allow collapse. With slow, heavy movement, he stood and straightened his coat. He pressed his palms against the table, as if drawing strength from the wood beneath him. When he finally spoke to his inner circle, his voice was steady, even though his heart felt shattered. "Gentlemen," he said, "if Berlin is lost to us, then we must secure the peace and defend democracy with our voices, our diplomacy, and our resolve for the battlefield now shifts to the future." His commanders nodded, their faces grim. They respected Eisenhower, but they shared Churchill's fear that while the war against Germany was nearly over, their conflict might only be beginning. They could already feel the chill of a political winter closing in. Later that day, Churchill sat alone, writing the speech he hoped would be remembered long after guns fell silent. He chose every word carefully, writing not as a politician seeking applause, but as a guardian, warning the world of danger ahead. He paused often to rub his eyes, exhausted beyond measure, yet refusing to stop. When the draft was finished, he read it aloud, his voice trembling with emotion. "The war is ending," he wrote, "but today, we stand at the edge of a new divide. We must not allow the fruits of victory to be lost in the shadows of mistrust and domination. The liberty of Europe cannot be entrusted to a single power. If we do not act now, an iron curtain may descend across the continent, separating freedom from oppression." Those present froze at the phrase, "Iron Curtain." It was a warning that cut through the room like a blade. Churchill looked up, sorrow in his eyes, but also fierce determination. He was not surrendering. He was preparing for the next fight, the fight to defend peace. When the message was eventually delivered to Parliament, the world felt its tremors. Churchill spoke with a fire that shook the chamber walls. He did not blame Eisenhower publicly. He refused to divide the alliance that had saved civilization, but his meaning was unmistakably clear. He called not for war, but for vigilance, not for anger, but for unity. "We have won the war," he said, "but we must now win the peace." Reports spread like wildfire across Europe. Soldiers read his words in newspapers soaked with mud and rain. Many wept silently. They had sacrificed everything, believing they were fighting to secure the world's future, and now that future felt uncertain. Mothers of fallen sons clutched the speech to their chests, hoping that the suffering of their children would still mean something. When news reached Eisenhower that Churchill had spoken publicly, he closed his eyes and sighed deeply, not in anger, but in respect. He understood the burden Churchill carried. He understood the passion behind his plea, and he knew that leadership often meant standing alone. Privately, Eisenhower whispered to his aide, "History will decide who was right. I pray it is kind to us both." And history did judge them not as enemies, but as men of immense courage, forced to choose between equally unbearable paths. The Cold War that followed proved Churchill's fears were real. Europe became divided, Germany split in two, and the world trembled through decades of tension and mistrust. Yet millions of lives were spared in 1945 because Eisenhower refused a battle that would have turned Berlin into a graveyard. Years later, when Churchill reflected on their clash, he wrote words that revealed his true heart. "I fought Eisenhower's decision, but I never doubted his honor. He sought peace when others sought triumph, and in that, he saved a generation from ruin." He laid down his pen and closed his eyes. a tear tracing down the face of a man rarely seen crying. History will remember him, he whispered, for his wisdom, not for what he refused to do, but for what he refused to risk. Thus, the story ends, not in hatred, but in reverence. Two leaders, different in vision, but united in purpose, each carrying the unbearable weight of decisions no human should ever have to make. The flags of victory waved over Europe, but beneath their flutter lay the silence of sacrifices no words could fully honor. And as time passed, one truth became clear: war is won by courage, peace is won by restraint, and greatness is proven not only by battles fought, but by battles refused.